Hello, everyone. Today is November 17th, and we have a special guest on the show, Austin Cole. Austin is an organizer, writer, and community planning practitioner. He is a member of and currently serves as the National Co coordinator for the Black Alliance for Peace, BAP, and co coordinates BAP's Haiti Americas team, which helped to launch the collective campaign for a zone of peace in our Americas in 2023. With the escalation from the US empire towards attacking the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela, shows that this fight against imperialism is not isolated, but another front in the struggle against US hegemony and is interlocked with our movements for liberation in Haiti, Palestine, and across the global south. This movement demands a coordinated and powerful response from all of our movements. BAP and 33 plus organizations are calling all anti war, peace, justice, union, and solidarity activists to organize actions large and small during this week of action, November 15th through the 23rd. Thank you, Austin, for coming on the show and welcome to the Activist News Network.
Yeah, thank you both.
Yeah, peace, Austin. Thank you for coming. We wanted to have you on to be able to ask some questions from your critical perspective. So, what would you say is the fundamental unresolved conflict between the U.S. and the Bolivarian Project in Venezuela? Is it primarily about human rights and democracy, as official U.S. statements claim, or is it, as the Black Alliance for Peace Haiti Americans team suggests, a deeper struggle over economic sovereignty and the right of a nation to use its resources outside of a US led neoliberal framework?
Yeah. Um, thanks again. It's really good to be here with y'all, John and Erica. I think you started to say it in the question there, but it's important to understand that this kind of conflict between the US and the Bolivarian Revolution in Venezuela has never been about human rights or democracy, right? Just as other fundamental conflicts between the US and other nations throughout the global South, where the US has intervened, has occupied, has dismantled those governments, those societies, are not about human rights and democracy, right? We know this has been the case for over 100 years, right? You can look at the examples of Haiti, Nicaragua, multiple times over in both of those countries. You can look at Cuba, you can look at Iraq, you can look at Iran, all throughout the Congo, all throughout the world, right? And so the biggest conflict between the U.S. and the Bolivarian Revolution or the Bolivarian Project in Venezuela is really, I would say, twofold, right? So one is, as you mentioned, around economic sovereignty, right, and the right of a nation to use its resources outside of not just the U.S.'s framework, neoliberal framework, but outside the U.S.'s complete control and domination, right? So the U.S. Back in the 40s, I believe, helped to overthrow democratically elected government in Venezuela because of Venezuela's oil resources, right? And so Venezuela was for a long time a really close U.S. ally throughout the region, right? And was a country through which the U.S. was able to exert its power in the region, along with many others. And so that aspect of oil, of also the natural gas that Venezuela shares with Trinidad and Tobago as well, is a really, really important part of this story, and is something that I think people have really aligned with the U.S. war in West Asia, right? With Iraq, with in Iran as well, and looking at the oil reserves that those nations have and their strategic position as well with regards to trade of oil. Um, but it also goes beyond economic sovereignty, right? Venezuela and the Bolivarian Revolution, that has been going since for over 25 years, um, and really in particular since 2003. in Venezuela has represented an alternative pathway for popular democracy, right, for popular sovereignty, and an alternative pathway as well for regional integration that does not bow to U.S. imperialism. So folks might know about ALBA, which is sort of a alternative regional integration mechanism that Hugo Chavez and the Bolivarian Revolution helped to create. Um, Hugo Chavez was also instrumental in CELAC, the Community of Latin American and Caribbean States, which is another regional integration mechanism, as well as supporting other kind of sub-regional integration mechanisms that, again, like Mercosur and others, and kind of supporting the visions of those as well. And so that aspect of being able to not only decide what natural resources a country is using, but also to be able to have political sovereignty, to have popular sovereignty, both at a domestic level and then also at an international level in terms of regional integration, is a huge part of why the U.S. cannot accept, the Bolivarian Revolution and the continuance of the Bolivarian Revolution in Venezuela. Right, it's been a huge stain on U.S. foreign policy, that in the U.S. State Department, that Venezuela continues to strive because after the Cuban Revolution, the mission was to never allow this to happen again. And so you see in Nicaragua with the Sandinista revolution, and you see in Venezuela with the Bolivarian revolution, that those are both kind of represent alternatives and represent kind of a slap in the face, right, to U.S. imperialism. And the goal is really to take down all of those. In particular, right now, Marco Rubio, who is the Secretary of State in the head Gusano, of that represents kind of the interest of reactionary, right wing, well, really Latin American diaspora, but also in particular Cubans, are kind of foaming at the mouth to take down Venezuela because they see that also as a step to taking down the Cuban Revolution too. So it's not about human rights, right? It's not about democracy. If it was about democracy, instead of demonizing the Bolivarian Revolution, we would actually learn from it. The PSUV, the United Socialist Party of Venezuela, actually just had a restructuring. Is going through a restructuring, and part of that is creating even more grassroots democracy, right? So over the last week, that process has been unfolding, and on the 23rd, there will be a kind of consulta popular, like a popular consultation, where different groups from the different communes, from the communal councils will come together to decide different projects that will happen all throughout the country. And so that is an actual form of popular democracy that is being built in Venezuela, where people really do have more collective self-determination over their lives and over what happens in a direct way, and they aren't ruled by US imperialist interests or corporate interests. And so that is a threat to the model of domination, or full spectrum domination, that the US really tries to, is intent on achieving throughout the world, but in particular in this hemisphere. And so that's why there's so much attention to this. Trump had a lot of attention in his first administration to overthrowing the Venezuelan government, and even said that if he would have been reelected, they would have been able to overthrow it. But this has been a bipartisan project, in particular, since the Clinton and Bush administrations, but in particular, since Obama administration in 2014. Obama signed an executive order declaring Venezuela a national security threat to the U.S. Right. So again, none of this actually has to do with anything about caring about the rights of people in Venezuela or caring about democracy in Venezuela. If that was the case, then the U.S. wouldn't be sanctioning Venezuela, would not be, and like I said before, we would be learning from the advances in popular democracy that are being made under the Bolivarian Revolution.
Thank you, Austin, for that thorough answer. That leads us to our next question. Thinking about the recent announcement from the U.S. Department of State designating Cartel de los Sols as a foreign terrorist organization with President Maduro leading it, We know the playbook of militarization being used on Venezuela through the occupation in Haiti, and how these last 4 years serve as a violation of the zone of peace in our Americas. How does the US labeling of gangs in Haiti as terrorist organizations set the pretext to the same language being deployed against Venezuela and President Maduro?
So to start, I think it's really important to know, and I know y'all know this, but for all the listeners, to understand that Cartel de los Soles is a made-up organization. It doesn't exist, right? And if it did ever exist, the only kind of this has been reported on kind of time and time again, even in the mainstream imperialist press, in CNN and even in Fox, like in all these different in all these different news organizations. It's pretty clear, yet the State Department and Rubio and the Trump administration continue to sort of peddle the lie. The only Cartel de los Soles that did exist was a name given by the DEA to actually a CIA supported cartel that was looking to that was looking to recruit people, or was recruiting people within the Venezuelan government to smuggle drugs, right? So if it did exist at all, it is created by the U.S. intelligence apparatus, right? So just needed to kind of say that because um, while it's important for us to talk about it, it's also important to understand that this is totally a fabrication of imperialist intelligence, right? To give the pretext to overthrow the Maduro government and commit regime change, and exploit Venezuela's resources and destroy the Bolivarian revolution. But coming to the question about the understanding of how militarization works in the playbook there, um, we have to understand that the way that white supremacy works and utilizes, and the way that imperialism utilizes white supremacy in particular, is that the things that are done things are done first to the nations that quote unquote no one cares about, or that are sort of exceptions to the rule, right? And Haiti has long been seen in this way, right, as an African nation, a black nation, a revolutionary nation throughout its entire history, right? Haiti has been demonized by imperialism, colonialism, white supremacy, as a savage nation, as a crime-ridden country, and that's been very easy for people to believe because of the sort of white supremacy, not only that is internalized individually for people, but because of the way that US and Western European powers have at every turn done their best to sabotage, destroy, and when needed, intervene in and destabilize the government and society of Haiti, right? And so this is something that happens time and time again that we've seen, not just in Haiti, but we see it throughout, throughout the world, and even we see it in this country as well, right? That if you are able to demonize a people, a community as drug ridden, right, or as kind of crime filled, then people will allow exceptions to happen to that community or to that nation that then basically normalize that militarization in the rest of society as well, right? So you saw that with the war on quote unquote, war on drugs here in the U.S., right, where you have plenty of government officials, whistleblowers, and others who have admitted that the goal of the Nixon administration was to sort of associate Black people, Mexicans, and leftists with drugs, and to fill Black neighborhoods with drugs to dismantle any attempts at social movement organization, right, and any attempts at real transformation. So you see that in Haiti, where there is a problem, there are challenges with violence, right? The paramilitary armed groups that exist in Haiti are terrorizing the population, right? But those same paramilitary armed groups are funded and supported by imperialists and oligarchs, imperialists abroad, right? Funded by the US, funded by Canada, funded by other, and the intelligence apparatus as well as the, quote unquote, domestic oligarchs, most of whom don't actually live in Haiti, but live in Miami, or live, now that they're being sanctioned, live elsewhere. in the Caribbean or in Europe, but who control the Haitian economy, right? Who own the ports, all these other pieces. So those are the folks who are actually controlling the gangs, and those are the ones who have utilized these quote unquote gangs to destroy the social movements and the popular uprisings that have been taking place, throughout, Haitian history, in particular since the end of the Duvalier dictatorship, but especially since 2019 in the more current iteration. There was a lot of movements against around labor struggles, and also around the way that the privatization of the ports, and the way that has been weaponized against the population, and the low and just low wages, and increases in fuel, or the elimination of fuel subsidies. So all of that popular uprising was basically decimated by a combination of instability in the political process that was created by the assassination of Jovenel Moise in July of 2021, by Colombian and other mercenaries, many of whom were trained in the U.S. At WINSEC, the Western Hemisphere Institute for Security Cooperation, which is formerly the School of the Americas, and linked to U.S. intelligence agencies as well. And so that, on one hand, that broader political instability, and then the expansion of the quote unquote gangs, who have really, as I said, have you know violated and really committed sort of massive acts of violence against the population, but not against any of the imperialist institutions, right? Not against the ports, not against all these other pieces that the oligarchs own throughout Haiti. So all that to say, so I don't get too far off the question, going into that context, all of sort of that pretext of crime, of labeling of gangs as terrorist organizations, even though those gangs are being propped up by the oligarchs and the imperialists, allows then for, a couple months later, for that same labeling of the Haitian paramilitary armed groups as gangs and as terrorist organizations to then say, and this other organization in Venezuela is a terrorist organization, and Maduro is, and Maduro is the head of it, right? And we're going to put basically a hit out for him. We're going to seize the Venezuela, one of his planes, right? That's the property of the state of Venezuela. And so it becomes a lot easier when people aren't paying attention to that happening in Haiti. And some people are even saying, yeah, that should happen in Haiti because these quote unquote gangs are so violent, and they're, destroying, they are terrorists. And then immediately that goes and happens to the rest of the, to other places in the region, in this case, Venezuela. And I would be like remiss if I also didn't talk about how the kind of labeling of state sponsor of terrorism has already been applied to Cuba, right, previously, and was reapplied to Cuba in particular because Cuba was hosting peace talks, right, between Colombia and the FARC and the ELN, in particular the ELN, which is one of the dissident armed groups in Colombia, and that was the pretext for labeling Cuba, or relabeling Cuba as a state sponsor of terror, right? And so that's really important to know, that this kind of language, while the normalization of it happens over time, right? And the more that people think that it is only going to be applied to Haiti or to Cuba or to Venezuela, right? We have to understand that I don't like to use the word like slippery slope or the phrase, but it is it allows for that normalization and for that expansion of the designation. So again, the way and understanding the way that imperialism utilizes both white supremacy and utilizes these kind of narratives about Haiti and about other nations as well, and basically just repeats them as a form of psychological warfare, allows for these policies, these violent and destabilizing policies, to expand throughout the region. And that's why it's really critical that, and we've said this from the beginning of when we launched the Zone of Peace campaign in 2023, and we've said this since the beginning of the Haiti Americas team in 2021, that Haiti cannot continue to be sort of left out of the conversation of the Caribbean and Latin America. Haiti cannot be treated as an exception because Haiti becomes a laboratory for the other forms of neocolonial domination and the other forms of imperialist violence and white supremacist violence throughout this region and also throughout the world as a whole.
I appreciate you giving that context because as you were speaking even about Haiti, the thing I was thinking about is even domestically here in the US, it is not to say that the crime in itself isn't happening, but the resolution to crime as a overt militarization or occupation of our communities, of our neighborhoods, of our nations, as resolve is not, I'm thinking of Fidel saying, who has the U.S. saved? To that point, the Black Alliance for Peace Haiti Americas team frames the regional crisis as a fundamental result of imperialist and neoliberal legacies. So given this, can you explain how the recent Alliance for Security, Justice, and Development strategy that was spearheaded in partnership with Guyana and the November 13th announcement of Operation Southern Spear with Trinidad and Tobago function as neocolonial mechanism?
Yeah, so I mean, both of these, and I'll try not to go into too much detail, I guess, in the answer, just for time around the context of them, but definitely encourage, the listeners to look up some of the writing that has been done previously on, in particular, on the Alliance for Security, Justice, and Development strategy, but also now on the Operation Southern Spear. So the reason that the U.S. is utilizing, this has been a strategy of the U.S. For a long time, but in particular since the end of the previous Trump administration through the Biden administration, which really beefed up a lot of this work, and then now, returning again with the Trump administration to really really have this understanding that, the U.S. needs to kind of not necessarily completely pivot, but needs to pay more attention to what is happening in the Western Hemisphere, but that the kind of older colonial mechanisms of doing that with just sheer domination were not really politically feasible, right? And so what the Biden administration really worked to do was to build this sort of strategy utilizing Southcom, U.S. Southern Command, and I know we're going to talk a little bit more about that later, to sort of spearhead these different types of what they kind of call like multinational partnerships, right, around security. And so that's what both of these partnerships with Guyana and then with Trinidad and Tobago function as ways for the U.S. to sort of, and for Southcom to lead from behind, right? While although that has changed a little bit under the Trump administration, which does feel a little bit more like brute force and kind of a return to some of the colonial, some of the colonial tactics of the past do serve its interests. At the same time, they still want to partner with regional countries in the region to really lead these military security endeavors, right? And so the way that the way that this functions is to say that we are going to work with Trinidad and Tobago, we're going to work with Guyana, or we're going to work with Panama, right? Or we're going to work with El Salvador, or we're going to work with any of the Dominican Republic, any of these nations that are willing to basically serve a neocolonial role, right? To kind of be the beachhead into destabilizing regional integration, right? Whether that be through CARICOM, the Caribbean community, or whether it be through CELAC, right? Or whether it be through the OAS, right? Which has kind of always been a U.S. imperialist mechanism, but still represents, a forum for, potential regional integration. And so the way that these neocolonial mechanisms have functioned is to really take this idea of partnership, right, or of integration with other folks in the region and sort of form a wedge between various different nations or various different regional bodies to basically make them ineffective and to also bring to further the dependency of Caribbean and Latin American countries to not only be economic dependency but also security dependency, right? And so while we can't say for sure the motivations behind Guyana, Trinidad and Tobago, Panama, other countries doing this, the U.S. has clearly, especially under the Trump administration, made threats, right, to those nations. And then also some of those nations, whether it's a Panama with the Panama Canal, right, and the U.S. threatening to take that back. And then in other instances, the U.S. has sort of made promises to nations like Trinidad and Tobago and Guyana around natural resources, whether it be oil or gas, or to support them on border disputes or things like that. And so these partnerships really function as sort of a coercive mechanism and neo-colonial mechanism for the U.S. to get partners in the region to basically be sort of the co-leads, right, or co-partners on this, and to really give this air of regional coordination and regional acceptance of militarism, right? Whereas in the past, CARICOM and CELAC is still this way, but CARICOM and some of the other regional entities were much more opposed kind of across the board to any U.S. intervention and U.S. Or any military intervention in the region. But this is really the way that the U.S. has kind of wedged their way back in there, in partnering with these folks and in bringing over the leaders of those countries into really under the U.S. thumb of domination.
Yeah, you mentioned because we're talking about these neocolonial relationships, but you mentioned Southcom, and I was wondering if you can maybe expand a bit on what Southcom is, and then the existing colonies like Puerto Rico, and how it's played a role in what's going on currently.
Yeah, so Puerto Rico is really important in this conversation, and a part of the conversation that I think obviously BAP has, and the broader folks in the Zone of Peace campaign have really been trying to uplift, and as well with our folks that we work with in Diaspora Palante Collective and Jupi and others. But the real kind of the long story short with Puerto Rico and the Southcom exercises and the ability of U.S. to perpetuate violence and extend their hegemony in the region is the fundamental issue that as long as colonialism exists in this region, right, no country, no entity in the region, no nation, no peoples are safe from the colonial influences of those powers, right? So whether it be the U.S. and Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands, and in other locations throughout the region, whether it be the UK and the Malvinas and Argentina, whether it be France and Martinique and Guadeloupe and others, whether it be the Dutch and Aruba and Curacao and other places. Those colonial holdings allow for the European and US powers to still have a launching pad, right? To still be able to be in easier striking distance, right? And then also to really make credible threats against other nations, other sovereign nations in the region, because they still have that actual colonial territory there, right? Obviously Puerto Rico is a really important example because it's the largest, by size, the largest island that is still a colony in the region, and it has been the site for many years of U.S. military bases, U.S. testing sites. Famously in 2003, the U.S. military stopped testing in Vieques because of the huge amount of opposition and long standing opposition by the Puerto Rican people and then by folks in solidarity with Puerto Rico. And so the way that the U.S. is utilizing Puerto Rico is actually remilitarizing a lot of those areas, right? Not that many of those places were never fully demilitarized, right? But they weren't being actively utilized, right, as sites for active military engagement. And so that has started back again. Now I believe at this point there's either 10 or 15,000 troops, U.S. troops in the Caribbean, right? Whether stationed, on land in Puerto Rico or in different uh, various different ships that are now stationed in the Caribbean. And so thinking like when we think about the importance of independence for Puerto Rico, right? The importance of a sovereign and independent Puerto Rico, we can understand again that no country is safe in the region if the US has that that launching pad, right? And that was kind of the original intention of having a colony there in Puerto Rico, right? Because it's sort of it's one of it's the easternmost kind of like Greater Antilles Islands, so it's very strategic from a shipping standpoint, but then also from an aircraft standpoint, from being able to launch from Puerto Rico versus trying to launch from the mainland of the U.S. It's much easier to do that, and so that I think is really important for people to understand. I would encourage people to look at Diaspora Palante Collective for some of the kind of more in-depth work that they've done around the militarization of Puerto Rico and the importance of an independent Puerto Rico, an independent and sovereign Puerto Rico for this exact reason, because of how the U.S. has been able to utilize it, not only in this instance with Venezuela, but also going back years. But I think it's been renewed in that utilization, and it's really important as well that we kind of understand that those wins that happened back in 2003 and previously can be undone as long as the fundamental contradiction of colonialism does not end, right? So even though those wins happened in the past and that was great, right? We see now 22 years later that has been, in many instances undone by this remilitarization. And so it points us to the understanding that we have to, that we can't sort of stop at these compromises, at these kind of like compromises for around militarization, that we have to actually defeat the colonial and militarized apparatus of US imperialism in every nation, or else that threat always remains.
Thank you, Austin. And even you mentioning the ongoing occupation of many Caribbean islands through U.S. military bases, it brought me back to thinking about Guantanamo Bay, which is still occupied by U.S. military bases in Cuba, and thinking about that strategic position being directly across from Haiti, how there's so many resources involved inside of that area, wind power, oil, etc., and how the U.S. military uses the strategic point to keep an eye on Cuba, but also keep an eye on the rest of the Caribbean. But this leads us to our next question, which is, what is the role of regional bodies like CELAC and CARICOM in response to the ongoing aggression led by the U.S. in their region?
So CELAC and CARICOM play a really important role in the region. As like already mentioned, the one of the biggest things that the US domination, the US imperialism is trying to do with its with these strategies is to have what they call full spectrum domination, right? So to be able to basically do what they want, when they want, how they want, whenever they, right? Um, and regional bodies like CELAC and CARICOM are powerful because any individual country going up against US imperialism and domination, which also is like the wider US EU NATO axis of domination, right? It's all of kind of like Western Western hegemony, right? Is hard, if not, nearly impossible, right? Cuba has done it, although they haven't, they've been supported in the past by the USSR, by Venezuela, by China, by, Bolivia, or by, yeah, Bolivia, Ecuador, some of the other countries as well, right? But it's a huge challenge, right? And one of the reasons Cuba has been able to do that and withstand that, and similar with Nicaragua, even though not as long for Nicaragua, 20 years less, and there's been some challenges there, is because of the revolutionary consciousness, and because of the sort of like ability of the revolution to actually take hold for many, many years. Um, the challenge now is that regional integration, which was a huge project of Alba, of folks like Chavez, of Castro, and the Cuban Revolution as well. Many of the folks like Rafael Correa in Ecuador, like Evo Morales in Bolivia, like various other leaders, in Uruguay and Argentina in the past, has been to bring together the nations of the region to be able to oppose the domination of US and of the US EU NATO axis of domination, and to be able to actually forge a sovereign path, right, for their nations, as a bloc and as a region. Now, that is also why one of the biggest projects of US domination is to break up these bodies, or to sort of or to infiltrate them, um, so that they are either not effective, or so that they can actually take imperialist lines, right? And you see that with CARICOM, which for a long time has emerged from the idea of kind of Caribbean unity, but really then kind of became more around like economic integration, and has from time to time, and does have political dimensions and social dimensions as well, and has from time to time, depending on the heads of some of the more influential nations, taken more progressive stances, but has, for its entire existence, really denigrated Haiti. Haiti was not part of CARICOM for a long time. It is now. BAP, we have sort of a primer on, and a fact sheet on Haiti and CARICOM, and the role of CARICOM, thinking about whether CARICOM is playing a role of regional integration or neocolonialism and imperialism in the region. It's trended much more towards the latter recently, right? So while I'm not going to say, and I'm not in the Caribbean, I'm not going to say that CARICOM is hopeless forever, right? Recently, and in recent years, it has been particularly trending in this kind of playing this neo-colonial role, especially when it comes to Haiti, but even in kind of CARICOM's inability to properly address this current crisis in the Caribbean, and U.S. Violence against the peoples of the Caribbean and Venezuela, and Colombia, and in the Pacific as well. And so I think that has been, a really big project of the U.S. is to infiltrate and to really steer those regional bodies towards supporting its neo-colonial aims. And at least with CARICOM, it's been really successful in that. Again, that's not to say that that integration is always doomed to follow that path. CELAC, on the other hand, and I mentioned before some of the role of CELAC in the past, and the role that Hugo Chavez, and others played in forming, in building up CELAC to really be this alternative, for the region, an alternative to like the OAS, right? CELAC has a really important role to play, but it as well has really found a lot of challenges because, like CARICOM, it's consensus based. And so the US has been able to, have some key allies now: El Salvador, Ecuador, Argentina, on the Caribbean side, Trinidad and Tobago, Guyana, Jamaica, as well, to some extent, slightly less, but still to some extent playing that role as well, allied with the US, and some others who have really blocked some of the more potentially progressive stances that the majority of CELAC member states have wanted to take, but have not been able to because of the need for consensus. And so you see that in Nicaragua in last year or earlier this year, I believe, at the beginning of the year, maybe sent out a letter after the CELAC kind of meeting and declaration to talk about Haiti and also to talk about imperialism and militarization in the region against the kind of broader consensus of CELAC because of the major issues that have been happening because of the blocks with CELAC, with some of those nations that were basically blocking resolutions that could be taken up by consensus. And that was a really big issue as well with Colombia over the past year. That has been the president pro tempore of CELAC, Gustavo Petro, and the Colombian president tried to sort of go around the consensus of CELAC when it with relation to the militarization of the Caribbean and this buildup. But that has been, a really big, that has been met kind of with some controversy because the point of the body is that this can be a regional body that can have consensus. So again, they do play a really important role. They should be opposing this aggression by the U.S. in the region. But as I mentioned, there's a lot of political challenges, not to mention all the sort of economic challenges with ongoing dependency of various nations, in particular in CARICOM, the Caribbean, to the U.S. And other U.S. partners, and the fear of kind of retribution from an economic standpoint if they go against any of the U.S.'s wishes in the region.
I appreciate you laying that all out because this week is a week of action, and it is calling for a collective people's response. So, can you talk about the Zone of Peace campaign that was launched in 2023 and some of the demands? And then, before we conclude, beyond the week of action, how can individuals and organizations continue to push for a zone of peace in our Americas?
Yeah, the Zone of Peace campaign was launched in 2023, April 4th, 2023, by about a dozen organizations, including Black Alliance for Peace. And we launched that campaign in Havana, Cuba, and Port-au-Prince, Haiti, and Washington, D.C., to really bring together this understanding of the importance of a grassroots and collective zone of peace, right? Because we understand the calls for the Caribbean as a zone of peace made by Maurice Bishop and many others from the 70s and 80s, the call for a zone of peace made by CELAC for the entire region to be a zone of peace, the entire Caribbean and Latin America in 2014 to be a zone of peace. But we understand that for us and for the peoples of the region, a zone of peace must be guaranteed at a grassroots level. A zone of peace must be fought for and felt and materialized by the peoples of the Americas, of our Americas, from Alaska and Canada down to Tierra del Fuego in Chile and Argentina. And so when we think about that, what it means to build a zone of peace, right? It is not to be outside of the important work that has to happen in these multinational forums like CELAC, at the UN, right, in CARICOM, and in all those spaces and all the various other spaces that exist, but that if a call for a zone of peace just stays there, just stays at the multinational level, just stays with national lawmakers, that it can be easily, one, it can be easily undone, and then two, it will never actually address the needs and what true peace looks like for the peoples of the entire region, right? The working classes, the oppressed, the colonized peoples of our Americas, right? And so we understand that a collective zone of peace that really takes on that grassroots character really has to be based in popular struggle and grassroots coordination across different organizations, and then working with some of those other institutions, but from a grassroots level. And so this week of action, that is really the part of the push for the week of action, is to build mobilization, to build education, and to build organization around the understanding of what it will take to build a zone of peace in our Americas, how we can oppose the US war in the Caribbean and Venezuela, and to really think about developing an America's wide consciousness that yes, we need to act locally, we need to act nationally at the levels that we are at and where we can affect things, but that must be done in a coordinated fashion internationally, right? So we can't sort of only do that work at the national level and only remain in those silos, regardless of how critical and time consuming and challenging that grassroots work is. We have to make sure that that work is coordinating with what's happening, because the folks who are oppressing our peoples, right, are international, right? The mining companies, that are extracting resources in the lithium triangle are based in Canada and Europe, in the US, right? The policymakers that are deciding and the weapons manufacturers that are supplying this war on Venezuela, right, are based largely in the US. And so understanding that opposition on the ground, where that extraction and where that violence is happening, as well as the understanding of that, how that opposition needs to be happening in the global north, where the war mongers are making those decisions and developing those weapons. So the six demands of the Zone of Peace campaign that we launched in 2023 are: one, to dismantle Southcom, U.S. Southern Command, and shut down the 76 U.S. military bases and installations in the region; two, to end US NATO militarism in our Americas; three, to disband US state-sponsored terrorist training facilities like WINSEC that I mentioned before, formerly the School of the Americas in Fort Benning, Georgia; four, to oppose military intervention into Haiti and support the people-centered movement for democracy and self-determination; five, to return Guantanamo to Cuba and end colonialism in our Americas; and six, to end imperialist sanctions and unilateral coercive measures, understanding that sanctions are a form of war as well. And so those demands really are, part and parcel of our contribution, and our goal in this work is to really understand that a zone of peace must, mean destroying and dismantling and expelling the forces of warfare, of capitalism, imperialism, neocolonialism, patriarchy, and violent militarism in our Americas as a whole. And that any peace that does not start with expelling those forces is not a true peace, right? It is kind of going back to this neocolonial form of domination that has allowed us to come back into this place where we are on the verge of, a full-scale war in this hemisphere. So without that peace, there can be no alternative. There can be no building of justice and liberation and all of the different forms of self-determination that might be able to flourish in our Americas if we do not have a peace that starts with ending imperialism and neocolonialism in our region.
Yes, Austin, very, very important points. And thank you for reviewing what our Zone of Peace campaign is so that our audience understands and also is able to share it with their organizations or any individuals they know here inside of our region. Before we close, we wanted to ask if you had anything else that you would like to share with the audience tonight.
Just to let people know that they can continue to push for a zone of peace in our Americas by connecting with the U.S. NATO Out of Our Americas network, which is the mass structure of the Zone of Peace campaign that is really working towards that popular struggle and international grassroots coordination. You can go to zoneofpeace.org. So ZONOFPEACE.org. You can look there for you can see the demands, you can see more, and then you can sign up for that. We just had a meeting yesterday, actually, around around what folks are doing in the region with relation to this. And you can also really, go on there and you can take some of the resources that we have. There's also resources on BAP's website, blackallianceforpeace.com/zone of peace, where you can see additional resources. And really, as I said before, the goal is part of it is being part of this broader network and structure. And part of that is building an America's wide consciousness, right? So understanding how can I link the struggles that are already happening locally, nationally in my community, right, with this broader understanding of how to build a zone of peace, right? And again, that comes with thinking about the alternatives, but also dismantling and expelling the forces of imperialism through our region. So just really to say that people can kind of formally join in that way and really work to just educate yourselves and your organizations. If you're not part of an organization, find an organization or build one where you can be thinking about these things. I would also recommend for folks in the Caribbean or interested in the Caribbean to check out the work of the Assembly of Caribbean Peoples that has also been pushing for the Caribbean as a zone of peace and is connected with a bunch of different organizations there, and they and in particular Movement for Social Justice and Trinbago for Palestine in Trinidad and Tobago have been doing a really phenomenal job in that country of really thinking about combating the neocolonial role that their nation is playing in all of this. So for other folks who may be in nations, that are playing similar roles, right? Or who may be part of diasporas of nations who are playing similar roles, I would look to folks like the MSJ, like Trinbago for Palestine, to see how you can actually kind of oppose that work from the inside or from the diaspora, because that's a really critical part of this zone of peace as well, is, as I said, thinking not only about the international connection in the struggle, but how do we link that to what's happening on the ground with where we are. So just encourage people to do that. Obviously, as well, you can go on the UNAC website to register events for Venezuela, for this broader week of action in Venezuela solidarity. I believe it's tinyurl.com/Venezuela-solidarity is the link where folks, if you're doing something locally during the week of action, or on either end of the, I guess on the latter end of the week of action, then you can go on that website and you can register any events that you have. So yeah, just really encourage people to take activity. Part of building consciousness is also building the activity and the action behind that, right? Consciousness is not only how we think about things, it's also how we act. And so that is really a really critical thing that, in particular in this moment, getting more comfortable with taking action and coordinating those actions among all of our peoples in the Americas.
Thank you, Austin, for joining us today on the show. To our audience, thank you for tuning in, and please support the incredible and courageous work that the Black Alliance for Peace does. It's not too late to plan an action, as Austin mentioned, or an event for the Week of Action. To find out more information, you can go to the blackallianceforpeace.com -defend Venezuela 2025. And that link is also inside the description to register your event and to learn more about the Week of Action. Thank you all for tuning in, and have a great rest of your night.
Thank you. No compromise, no retreat.
No
No
compromise,
compromise,
no
retreat.
We state these facts only to let you know that those of us who are revolutionary, Pan-Africanists, is not because we love revolution. It is historically determined, and we have no alternative but to follow history and to use history for the benefit of our people.